Welcome to Thoughts and Bolts. This is Pedro. Today's show is called Science Finally Catches Up with Schopenhauer. Okay. And what I'm going to talk about are Arthur Schopenhauer's ideas, how science has caught up with him to some extent, and how Arthur Schopenhauer can help us make sense of the UFO phenomena. Now, before talking about Schopenhauer, you have to talk about Kant. Okay, Kant precedes Schopenhauer and he inspired him. And Kant made a very big philosophical move, a huge insight that he had, and he shared it with us. And it is the Kantian split. This is to say that for Kant, there is a difference between the world as it actually is, which is what he called noumenon, and the world as it is experienced through the five senses, which he called phenomenon. Okay, so for Kant, there's a difference between the world as it actually exists, independent of your five senses, and the world that you experience through the five senses. They're not the same. Okay, and for Kant, all of our mathematics, all of our physics, all of our sciences deal with the phenomenal world. That is, the world as it is experienced by human beings through the five senses. They do not describe the world as it actually is, independent of the five senses. Okay? So, phenomenon is the world as it is experienced through the five senses, and noumenon is the world as it actually is, independent of our experience. And for Kant, they were totally different, or at least different. Okay. Kant's main point was that we cannot know the noumenon. That was his belief. We cannot know what the noumenon is. But Schopenhauer is a little different. So here's a nice little art somebody made. So the world of phenomenon and the noumenon. Okay, phenomena and noumena. Okay, they're different. One corresponds to the other, but one is not the other. Okay, and we have to make that clear, and you're going to see why it's actually true. So, Arthur Schopenhauer, in his book, The World as Will and Representation, starts off with accepting this Kantian split. Okay, but he goes a little deeper, and I'll show you how. Okay, so that's a picture of me. Okay, if you were to meet me, and you were to see my glasses and my double chin, and my shoulders, whatever, um, that image of me, okay, the smell of my cologne, the sound of my voice, is phenomenal. It's a phenomenon. Okay, it's some image, an experience of me that your brain generates. Okay. But what about the noumenon, right? What am I really, right? Because as Kant showed us, there's a difference between what I really am and how you perceive me through the five senses. Now, you as the subject and cannot know that about me as the object, but there is something I can do. Okay. I, as the subject, can look at my own hand, right? I can look at my own legs, my own chest, my own stomach, my own shoulders. I can even see my nose a little bit. And I see the phenomenal representation of me, right? I can see my own hand. But I can also see what's behind my hand. I can also feel what's behind my body. And what's behind my body, what's behind the phenomenon is feeling, it's emotion, it's thoughts, it's subjective experience. And so Schopenhauer decided to rename the noumenon will and the phenomenon representation. This is where Schopenhauer breaks with Kant, right? Kant said the noumenon is unknowable. But Schopenhauer said, in the case of the human being, you yourself can look inward You yourself, in the case of yourself, can look behind the phenomenon and see what's there. And it's a will to live. Okay. And so that's what the nomenon is. It's a will. Now, that would mean that space, time, matter, and energy are representations of the one will, right? Because multiplicity requires space and time. But if those are all products of the mind, then that would mean that the will is unitary. Okay, so for this first part, we're going to focus on representation. Okay, we're going to get into will later, but at first, we're going to talk about representation, specifically when it comes to science. Okay, because that's what Schopenhauer does in his book. This book is 2 volumes, and the first volume is about representation. Then he talks about will, and that's what we're going to do. Okay, now he says, the world is my representation. Okay. This is a truth valid with reference to every living and knowing being. Although man alone can bring it into reflective, abstract consciousness. If he really does so, philosophical discernment has dawned on him. He goes on. It then becomes clear and certain to him that he does not know a sun and an earth, but only an eye that sees a sun and a hand that feels an earth. That the world around him is there only as representation. In other words, only in reference to another thing, namely that which represents, and this is himself. Of any truth can be expressed a priori, it is this. For it is the statement that form of all possible and conceivable experience, a form that is more general than all others, than time, space, and causality, for all these presuppose it. Okay, now he goes on. Therefore, no truth is more certain, more independent of all others, and less in need of proof than this, namely that everything that exists for knowledge, and hence the whole of this world, is only object in relation to the subject, perception of the perceiver, in a word, representation. Everything that in any way belongs and can belong to the world is inevitably associated with this being conditioned by the subject, and it exists only for the subject. The world is representation. Okay. Now he wrote this in the 1800s, and it's self-evidently true. Okay. Think about it. Look at the animal kingdom. Look at, let's just stick with eyes. This isn't even going into ears and skin or tongues or noses. Okay. Just look at the eyes in the animal kingdom. And then look at the different nervous systems that exist in the animal kingdom. Okay. The first person subjective experience of the world that a bee has is going to be radically different than that which an octopus has or that which a human being has. Okay. Now, there is something that exists. There is a world that exists outside the body of the bee, outside the body of the octopus, and outside the body of the human being. Okay. There is a there. Okay. But how the human being experiences the nominal world, the world as it is, and how the octopus experiences it, and how the bee experiences it at a subjective level is going to be totally different. Okay. So this should be all I need to say. But there's more. Okay. If you study the way neuroscientists, Our brain scientists are studying the brain today with something called the free energy principle, a theory called active inference. It makes all of this make even more sense. Okay, we naively assume that, like, oh, we observe the world and then we act on it, but that's not true. What we do is we make predictions about what we will experience. We act on those predictions. We observe what happens, and then we change our perceptions or we change our beliefs because there's always a discrepancy between our prediction and the observation. And so your brain wants to reduce that discrepancy as much as possible. Okay. And so Carl Friston and his associates mapped this out more mathematically, right? They call the brain internal states, the world external states, and there's a divide between them, the active and sensory states, right? Which are also called Markov blankets. Okay. And I did this nice little drawing for you. Okay. These five objects represent organisms. Okay. And you have internal states in red and external states in white. And you have the Markov blanket. And the Markov blanket is simply anything, it's a mathematical abstraction like what we saw here. Okay. But if anything, it's just something that separates internal states from external states. Okay. That's the most basic thing. Okay. And going back to this prediction, observations, prediction, action, observation, perception cycle, okay, what these organisms do is rather than perceive the world as it actually is, nature takes a shortcut. All they have to do is rub up against the most proximate external states. And based on those experiences, create a model, okay, of what the entire scene looks like, okay? And we can see this naturally with airplanes, right? The airplane in this analogy is a Markov blanket. The internal states are the pilots. The external states is the air and the earth, right? Same thing. Your brain, internal states. External states, what's outside your body. The Markov blanket is your body, okay, or what's represented as your body, right? And when there's a crazy thunderstorm and the pilots can't see where the plane is in relation to the earth, they use instruments, don't they? And these instruments are symbols, okay? They are representations of what's outside, okay? They correspond to and represent what's outside symbolically, okay? And so they can tell how far they are from the earth, what direction they're flying in, how fast they're flying in. Okay. They don't actually have to see the outside of the cockpit at all. And they don't have to count, feet from the plane to the floor, okay, to the earth. They have this dashboard of dials, okay, which represent external states in a way that's simple. It's a model that allows them to make predictions that would allow them to act in ways that will allow them to survive. Okay. And the better the model, the better the symbols on the screen, the less discrepancy there will be between their predictions and the observations of what they see on the screen. Okay. And so the same thing goes with a user interface on your cell phone, okay, or your tablet. I, for one, don't know how any of this works. Okay. I don't know the first thing about circuits or electrons or, batteries and how all of this works. But I don't need to. Okay. I have a user interface. And that user interface, again, is filled with symbols which represent and correspond to the actual workings of the cell phone, which I don't even need to understand. All I need to understand are the symbols. Okay. And the same thing works with us. Our brains are, or what we represent on our cognitive user interface as brains, okay, our internal states are forever locked out from any contact with the outside world. And so what do we do? How do we how do we survive? Well, for billions and millions of years of through evolution, okay, we've evolved a certain kind of user interface which allows us to predict what we will experience so that we can act in a way that allows us to survive. Okay. Now, this is the user interface, the interface theory of consciousness, okay, which was pioneered by Donald Hoffman and his associates. And what they show is that, there are certain fitness payoffs, right? These animals, they need to fight, they need to feed, they need to flee, and they need to fornicate, okay? And those are the four main important things of life: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and fornicating. Okay. And so most things in life, um, there's are in a happy medium in order to be attuned to survival. Okay. Too much food is bad, not enough food is bad. Too much oxygen is bad, not enough oxygen is bad. Okay. And I love how Hoffman explains it. He says, seeing truth or seeing noumenon, okay, hides fitness. And seeing fitness hides truth. Our senses, for instance, don't perceive oxygen. We didn't discover oxygen until 1776. Instead, our senses report fitness. We feel a headache if there is insufficient oxygen, and lightheaded if there is too much. Likewise, our senses don't perceive ultraviolet radiation. Indeed, we didn't discover this radiation until 1801. Instead, our senses report fitness. We feel sunburn if we receive too much ultraviolet radiation. Okay. So, in other words, our five senses, okay, did not evolve to see the world as it actually is. They evolved so that we can model the world in a way that is attuned to our fitness. And as Hoffman shows in this scientific paper, which you can read on your own, or in this wonderful book, we don't see any of it, okay, through our five senses. In other words, Kant was right, okay? And then there's this beautiful paper in Scientific American, this article by Neil Seth, and he's a neuroscientist. And he says, the contents of our perceptual worlds are controlled hallucinations, brain based best guesses about the ultimately unknowable causes of sensory signals. For most of us, most of the time, these hallucinations are experienced as real. As rapper and science communicator Baba Brinkman suggested to me, when we agree about our hallucinations, maybe that's what we call reality. Okay? So, this whole podcast you're listening to is a hallucination. Okay? But it corresponds to and represents something outside of your internal states. Okay. And the same thing is true for everything we've experienced in the world. Okay. And this is all about, like I said, fitness payoffs, right? The bee, the octopus, and the human all eat different kinds of things. They live in different environments. They have different lifespans. And so they need to perceive the world completely differently in order to survive. Okay. Now, what does this have to do with the UFO phenomenon? Well, I'm going to share with you in the links. If you're seeing this on Twitter, you're going to see it in the comments. If you're seeing this on YouTube, you're going to see it in the description. But one really cool optical illusion, which kind of proves this point about uh, the mind creating models about reality, and then um, changing those models, changing those beliefs based on a discrepancy. Okay. Um, and then this awesome video about the rubber hand illusion. But again, what does this have to do with the UFO phenomenon? Well, let's look at the UFO phenomenon. Okay. We've all heard stories of, let's say, there are four people in a group and they all look at a UFO, they see a UFO, but one guy says it's a saucer, one guy says it's a triangle, and one guy says it's a cylinder. But the fourth friend, he took a picture and no, it was shaped like a star. Okay. Well, again, what is the UFO? Okay. It's a symbol that our mind creates to represent something. Okay. So maybe that's what this is all pointing to, right? The phenomenon is showing us that, look, what you perceive is not reality, but again, a symbolic representation which corresponds with reality, and that symbolic representation can be hacked. Okay, if you go to Skinwalker Ranch, which was a UFO hotspot studied by the Pentagon, there were, to put it charitably, multiple people at the same time seeing what might be described as impossible animals, such as the infamous dino beaver, right? Or you have Jay Stratton's wife and family and their associates seeing a bipedal wolf outside their home, in which was far from Skinwalker Ranch, and they didn't even know what Daddy was doing at work. Now, a bipedal wolf is an impossible animal. So is a dino beaver. And that's the whole point, guys. That's the whole point. Okay. What we perceive is not real. Okay. It corresponds to what's real. Okay. Same thing with this experiencer that was interviewed by Jesse Michaels. In his experience, his abduction, he experienced some mantis alien eating his face. But when you look at his face, there's not a mark on him. He looks clean. He doesn't have one scar on his face. Again, will and representation. Okay. And again, I go back to all the reports of grays walking through walls. What is a wall? What is a face? They are representations of something else. So now look, we're going to head into will now. Part of ufology involves parapsychology, okay? Telekinesis, telepathy, clairvoyance. Arthur Schopenhauer teaches us. We are only that one eye of the world which looks out from all knowing creatures, but which in man alone can be wholly free from serving the will. In this way, all difference of individuality disappears so completely that it is all the same whether the perceiving eye belongs to a mighty monarch or to a stricken beggar. What he's saying is that at a fundamental level, there's only one will. Okay? As I go back to this one slide, there is only one will. Okay? And this space time matter energy representation of reality, it's simply a representation of that one will, this fundamental one mind. Well, if at a fundamental level, there's only one mind, then telepathy should be expected, right? We should expect there to be telepathy. We should expect there to be clairvoyance. Okay. In short, we should expect there to be miracles. Okay. Because the space time matter energy reality that we sense through our five senses is nothing more than a useful fiction which we use to navigate through existence. Okay. And science has finally caught up with that idea. And I think that the second part of the equation, that the world is will and representation, the will part, that's what parapsychology is telling us. And that might be what the UFO phenomenon is telling us. Because once again, if at a fundamental level there's only one mind, right? Then, you know, there should be some communication between minds. So that's it for today. Remember, as always, your consciousness is not classified. Look inward so you can understand what you see when you look upward.